So, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining my talk today. So I'm gonna share with you my experiences of using online experimental tools to study language learning and processing. So, as Emily mentioned, so I'm interested in language learning and processing. So online experimental tools are one of the tools that I have been using to collecting data from children and also from adults and special populations. So here's the outline of my talk. So I'll first introduce my motivation of using an online tools, and then I'll give you a brief introduction about the three tools that I have been using most often, including Qualtrics, Gorilla, and the video conferencing tools. Then I will provide four examples, including picture verification, pronunciation readings, and semantic truth judgment, and the language projection as examples of how the tools can be applied in data collection. And then I will end my talk with a summary. So why online experiments? So most of the academics, so we get to know online experiments because of COVID-19, right? At that time, it was really difficult to get access to participants. But I got to know online experiments a little bit earlier, about 10 years ago, when during the discussion about the replication crisis. So at that time, there were two reasons that have been pointed out why some of the studies have been difficult to be replicated. So one reason is because of the sample size issue, right? So like most of the studies that we have been conducting have a relatively small sample size, around 20 or 30 participants. So, like lab-based experiments can be very time-consuming and costly. So a lot of the labs, we do not really usually collect data from a larger sample sizes. And also another reason that the researchers point out might be because of the bias of the participants. A lot of the participants, they're university students, so that they were known as weird participants, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic participants. So it's really important to collect more data and collect data from different types of participants. So at that time, I read a paper from Professor Robswan. I was still a PhD student at that time. So in this paper, he replicated all of his lab-based experiments using Qualtrics that I will introduce later. And this paper was so eye-opening for me. And I was like, oh, wow, you can actually do experiments online and with such good quality of the data. So if you haven't read this paper before, I definitely recommend you to read it. And they also specify their procedure of collecting data online. I think that will be very useful. And so why online experiments, right? As I mentioned, so because a lot of our participants today, they got a laptop, they have a phone, so it's very easy to collect data from them. So especially if you are interested in collecting data from native speakers, so it's much easier to use online experiments. So you get access to all kinds of native speakers of English, French, or German, or any other languages. And sometimes it's much easier to collect larger sample sizes from because it's easier to get access to them, right? And also it's more time and cost efficient. But there are some potential issues with online experiments. I think one of the biggest concern is the data quality. Because the participants we use different types of phones or tablets or laptops, and we have different browsers. We have different speed of internet connection at home. So this can be issues if we present audios or pictures to the participants. And also we don't really have a control of the environments where participants at. For example, they might be in a noisy environment while they do our task. We can't control of the state of the participants, for example, whether they are large enough to do the experiments and whether they provide true information during the experiments. So later I'll provide some tips that I have been using to try to control the data quality of online experiments. So here are the tools that I have been using especially for Qualtrics, I have been using since 10 years ago. And Gorilla is a tool that have been using recently. I haven't tried Inquisite, CyclePy, or Cycle Toolkit, but I heard they're quite good as well. For participant recruitment, I used Amazon Mechanic Turk before, and because it's mostly used in the US. So if you're interested in native speaker of American English, Amazon Mechanic Turk can be a good place. And the Prolific, I heard it's quite good too, but I haven't tried it before. And there are other platforms such as Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey. If you pay a fee, they'll be able to recruit participants for you as well. And for video conference softwares, the Zoom that we're currently using is really popular. And the mainland China Tencent meeting is a very good option. But there are other good options as well, like Microsoft Hangouts, Google Hangouts or Microsoft Teams. But one drawback of those tools, a lot of the tools are not actually free. You need to pay a fee. So, and it depending on what kind of package you get, some of the packages can be quite expensive. So there are also free packages that are available now. So for example, the Jet Stack that I will try in future, I would like to use it, but I haven't tried it yet. So there's a tutorial from Edinburgh University. I recommend you to read it. So if you're interested in using it, there are also other tools that are free as well. So for example, the Landless Lab and SimplePy and LabVents and also LabJS. So I think it'd be good to explore those free options as well. So now I'm going to briefly introduce you the three tools that I'm mostly familiar with. So the first one is Qualtrics. So 10 years ago, Qualtrics was your startup company. At that time, it's actually they got two kinds of accounts. One is for academics, so for us who would like to collect experimental data. Another one is for commercial companies. But I think it's getting more and more commercialized these days. But the core features remain the same. So the Qualtrics provides like very nice webinars. So if you haven't used Qualtrics before, you may want to check out the webinars first, so you get the basics. And the user interface looks like that. So you could start a project, for example, like a survey. But if you would like to use like more advanced options, like the timing function, you would upgrade. You would have to upgrade your account to pay a fee in order to use this type of function. So the timing function I'll mention later is very important for us, so we can collect the reaction time. And also, there's another nice feature of Qualtrics is that it could import or export scripts from a previous project so you don't have to build your script from scratch. And for export function can be useful if you're using a questionnaire-based study, so you could export it to be like a traditional paper kind of questionnaire. Another function of Qualtrics I found is quite useful is to collaborate. So you don't have to edit the experiment just by yourself. You could collaborate with your colleagues or students, so everybody can edit or view the experiment. So the basic structure of Qualtrics is very similar to any lab-based experiments. You can present participants different types of questions. For example, you may ask them to read certain sentences, paragraphs, or you may ask them to listen to audios or view at pictures, and you can provide them different options. For example, you may ask them to do true or false judgments or ask them a multiple choice question. And the survey flow can be very similar to lab-based experiments. For example, you could do the consenting first, and then the instruction, and then you provide practice trials, and then the experiments, and the thank you part. And for each of these flow, you could design them as a block. For example, for the experiment part, you may want to repeat the same trials multiple times. You could use a loop function, or you may randomize your experimental trials using the randomization options, for example. So timer is a very important function of Qualtrics. So with timer, you can control or measure how much time participant is spent on a given page. So to use this function, you may place the timer before or after a question, right? So for example, you may want to present a fixed session cross for 1,000 milliseconds, then you could place a timer there and specify to be like 1,000 milliseconds. Or you may just want to know how much time they spend on this page, and you can place a timer there. And also another function of timer is sometimes you may force people to stay on a given page. For example, if you are presenting audio files that last for 1 minute, you could place a timer that lasts for 1 minute as well. So participants have to stay on this page for at least 1 minute before they could progress to the next page. And HTML and JavaScript can be incorporated to Qualtrics as well. So this can be very nice as well, and I'll show you some examples. So for example, in a typical lab-based experiment, sometimes you would want participants to respond only with keyboards, right? So they would press the space bar to present the next page or press certain keys like F and J to indicate their answers. So in this case, you would like to hide the mouse, and the JavaScript can be really handy. So you can type certain scripts in there, and so the mouse can be hidden there. Another thing about HTML scripts is that you can hide the annoying Qualtrics footer, because on each page of the Qualtrics experiment, you'll say this is supported by Qualtrics.com. And you may want to hide this information during the experiments because you don't want participants to get distracted. And also, another very important function of HTML language is you may preload your files, because sometimes the picture files or audio files can be big. So if participants' internet connection is not good enough, they may get a delay there, so which will influence your data. So in this case, you may preload your files when participants are reading the instructions. So there will be no delay when they come to the page to view the pictures or hear the video audios or view the videos. And also you may want to provide some breaks during the experiment, and HTML script can be handy as well. And also sometimes you may want participants to hear the video after they click on the picture, so you may want to use HTML language as well. But so if you kind of do not have any experiences of using Java or HTML language, don't worry about it. So there's in the base Canva Qualtrics, you can find some scripts that people have been using. So I think they also got out like a Q&A session in their forum as well, and the technical support can be really quick. So if you email them, and they're usually pretty good at responding to you. So, but recently I gave up Qualtrics and using Gorilla instead. So I think one of the reasons is because I just started my lab group in Chongqing University, and Qualtrics can be quite expensive to me because you have to pay first before you can actually use the more advanced options. So Gorilla is a very nice alternative, because for Gorilla it's actually free to you to build your experiments, but you only need to pay for data collection. So if you, for example, if you only need about 100 participants, I think Gorilla can be a better option. But I'll show later that Gorilla has some drawbacks compared to Qualtrics, but it also has some advantages. So here's the page when you log into Gorilla. And so just like Qualtrics, you'll be able to have tutorial section there. So I would recommend you to watch the tutorials before you start, and it can be quite useful. And their technical support is really good as well. They're usually pretty quick, like within 24 hours they'll respond to your questions. And like I mentioned, so I think if you do not need to collect a lot of data, then I think Gorilla might be a better option because they have different packages. So it's a free to build experiment. You could have a pay-as-you-go account. So you pay for about $1 for per respondent, or you could buy like a package with 200 respondents with 230 US dollars. I think the lab-based package is quite nice as well. So this will make it a little cheaper. Um, for it's like 1,800 US dollars for 2,000 respondents. So it's really flexible. I think it depends on how many participants that you will get per year. So this is example of our recent experiments. So by using Gorilla, we were collecting data from 3 to 6 years old. So in this part is called the text and questionnaire section. So where you kind of design the separate experiments there. For example, we have to ask participants to tell a story. It's called a frog story, right? It's a picture book participants view, and then they have to tell what is happening in there. And then we have the consent forms, and we have another task called picture naming and the rapid automatic naming. So you first design separate tasks first, and then you put them together in this experiment part. So here's the procedure that we use to collect data. So you start from the consent forms, and then we collect data from them using the RAN task, rapid automatic naming task, and then it's a frog story task, and then the finish part. So I think it's pretty easy to use as well. And you can also use, for example, randomization functions and the loop function in Gorilla as well. So here's the page for the frog story task. So in here, we have instruction for participants, and we can also specify what participants will view on each page using a spreadsheet. I think this comes quite nice as well. So you don't have to upload everything to Gorilla, but you could just use a spreadsheet to specify the stimulus. So this is very similar to lab-based software such as ePrime. And also, Gorilla allows you to preload the stimuli. For example, this is the experiments that we have been using to ask participants to view the videos, and then there are some experimental tasks they need to complete. Because the videos can be quite big, so it's quite nice that Gorilla also allows us to preload the audio file. And the last kind of tools that have been using is Tencent Media and Zoom to collect data from young children or non-native speakers. I think because sometimes they really need some help, although during the online experiment. So I think this sharing screen function is quite nice. You could have participants to share their screen with you so you can see what is going on there. And also you could use the recording function. So you could have a backup of the data. For example, if you're telling a story, and if you use the recording function, you can have a two set of data sets, right? One is from the, for example, Gorilla, another is from the video conferencing software. So I think that's quite nice. So now I'm gonna move on to share with you some of the examples that how I have been using this tool. So the first example is about a picture verification task that have been done using Qualtrics. And here's the paper. So if you are interested, you may check out the details in this paper. So let me share with you a little bit background of this study. So we were interested in how we represent the object representations in language processing. So for example, when I hear the word ice cream, right? So what kind of images of the ice cream that we would represent, whether it's kind of typical an original state or whether it's kind of like a dropped ice cream on the floor, it's called a modified state. Similarly, for the dustbin word, so when we heard the word dustbin, well, you represent dustbin as this kind of original state or modified state. So here, in this study, we've done 3 experiments, so all on Qualtrics. So in the first experiment, participants just heard the words, for example, the ice cream or the dustbin, and then they have and then they were presented with a picture. Then they have to judge whether the picture was mentioned in the words. So so in the first experiment, we collect data from over 100 participants from the US. They are all native speakers of English. And in the second experiment, we present the stimuli using past tense sentences. For example, the women choose the ice cream or the women dropped the ice cream. So we change the event type. So for example, in the drop condition, while participants represent they dropped ice cream or still the original ice cream, right? And we collect data from over 200 participants from the US. And in the last experiment, we use the future tense. So we would say the woman will drop the ice cream or the woman will choose the ice cream. And then we present the picture, ask them to judge whether the object was mentioned in the sentence as well. So of course, there are also fillers which were not relevant to the word. So here's what we found. So we found that there was a typicality effect. Participants responded faster to the original state if they just heard the object's name, for example, ice cream. But if the stimuli were presented in the participants in the past tense case, for example, the woman dropped or chose ice cream, there were interaction effects. So the blue line represents a substantial event. That means the dropped event. So when participants heard the women dropped the ice cream, they were faster to respond to the modified state compared to the original state. And also, when participants heard the women choose the ice cream, they actually were faster to respond to the original state. And for the future tense sentences, we still saw this effect of the object state, but on the modified object, but not so on the original state. So when we say the woman will drop or will choose the ice cream, there was no difference in the reaction time of the original state. So in all of these experiments, we use the same criteria for excluding data that were not good. For example, we for reaction times, we excluded trials that were either too fast or the participants who spent too long at responding. For example, for trials that got RTs shorter than 300 milliseconds or longer than 3000 milliseconds, we actually excluded the data, and the results were pretty robust. Okay, so the next example that I mention is about pronunciation ratings. So here are the papers. So if you're interested, you may want to read these papers. So remember I mentioned that, so sometimes we collect speech samples from participants. So in these studies, we have non-native speakers of French, German, and Spanish. So they told a frog story in the target language, that is in either Spanish, French, or German. And we would want to know how good their pronunciations were, right? So it's kind of their proficiency measures. But it's really difficult to find enough native speakers of French and German Spanish in Hong Kong. So we use Qualtrics instead. So we kind of design this task on Qualtrics, and we ask Qualtrics to help us to find the participants in France and German and Spain as well. So in this study, we have a lot of data from participants. In total, we have actually around speech samples around over 900 of participants. So for example, we have 292 speech samples from French speakers and over 200 from German speakers and over 300 from Spanish speakers. So it's a lot of work if the native speakers have to listen to the whole episode of a storytelling, right? So that's what we have done. So So first we recruit the native speakers of the target language with no or very limited exposure to Cantonese. And instead of using the whole episode of storytelling, we use two excerpts. So one at the beginning and one at the end of the storytelling. So each lasts only 20 to 30 seconds. Um, and then we use to counterbalance the list. So participants could complete the rating task roughly around the same time for each list. And then we divided the list into sub questionnaires for because we have so many audio files. So we divide them to be like around 20 to 30 trials per questionnaire, so participants can complete the ratings within 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And for each sub questionnaires, we have around 16 native speakers to be the raters. So they use a 9-point visual analog scale. So it's a little bit similar to what I showed the smiley face, although I only have 5 faces there, but actually we use a non kind of smiley face scales. So if the native speakers find that their pronunciation is very good and very native like, they would choose, for example, non. And we collect this data using Qualtrics, and the recordings were randomized. So here's what the original data look like. So when you get the data from Qualtrics, so you would have, for example, the name of the sub questionnaires and the date and the end date of participants who completed the data. And the nice thing is that you could get the IP address as well, so you could check whether participants actually were in the target countries. For example, if your target country is France, you would also check out the IP address and can exclude anyone who is not currently there. And also, you know the duration of the experiment as well. And this is their ID, which is kind of unique to the participants. And right, you also know the browser type and information like that, and how they completed task. There are also other information as well as for example, the response times and the rating. So we found that the data were quite reliable. So for all of the ratings, we found the correlations between the beginning and the end part of the experts were quite high, so around 0.81. And for French, the correlation is very high. For German, it's still a little bit smaller, and for Spanish, it's still good, but they're all significant. And also, we check out the correlation matrix of how the native rating is related to other proficiency measures. For example, the length measure of the storytelling and the content, the quality content of the storytelling, and their final exam scores of each term. And the RT is from their reaction time to picture naming, and the accuracy is also from the picture naming. So as we can see here, the native list scores actually correlate with other measures of the proficiency as well. So the next example that I'm going to introduce is called a semantic truth judgment test. So this study is still ongoing. My student Jinru is going to present the results next month in a conference in my call. So in this experiment, we're interested. We're interested in the participant semantic judgment of our sentences. For example, if the target, I don't know why it's moving. So for example, the target sentences is so there was a loud voice, right? Oh, wait for it. The target sentences was there was a like a loud voice and wait, sorry, I don't know what is happening. So anyway, and so participants read a sentence and then they will view a probe, and then they have to judge whether the probe is true or false. So because of the wait first. I don't know. Let me end the show. Okay, let me show you like this. Okay, the participants, they need to read the sentence, and then there's a probe. Then they need to judge whether the probe was true or false, right? So, and so we collected data using Gorilla, and we were measuring the response times there. So now we will know the reading times of the target sentence, and we'll be able to know the response times for the probes. So as we demonstrate here, so this is the experimental conditions that we have. So there were, depending on the experimental conditions, there were many facts of semantic truth. So, and also we were able to get the accuracy rate to the probe as well, and the response times to the probe. We're currently doing lab-based experiments, and I think these effects are pretty robust and pretty confident that we'll be able to replicate the effect in the lab. So here's a very similar study that we have been doing, but it's about COVID-19 related rumors. So participants first, they say a fixed session cross for 500 milliseconds, right? So using the timer function that I mentioned, and then they'll read COVID-19 related statements as long as they like, and then they have to judge whether the statement is true or false, and then we'll tell them their accuracy rate at the end of the experiment. So we collect the data from around 100 participants. So I think the data is also pretty robust there. So for example, for reading time, we found there is a length effect, right? So when the sentence is longer, participants actually spend more time reading the sentences. This actually makes a lot of sense, right? The veracity refers to whether the statement is true or false. So as we can see here, there's no fixed effect of veracity for reading time. Reading time is only primarily influenced by the length of the statement. And also we saw that for accuracy rate, there's also an effect of the length. So for longer statements, participants were actually less accurate at responding to them. And also for response times, we saw there's a veracity effect. So when the statement is actually true, participants were faster. But also there's the interaction effect that I will show you now. So this is quite interesting. So although we've done this in Gorilla, I think we're also kind of confident that we'll replicate in the lab because this is quite interesting. So this is the length represents the how many characters that the statement have, and the response time is how long the spends at judging whether the statement is true or false. So as we can say, for like a true statement, when the statement is getting longer, it's actually easier for participants to judge the veracity, right? They're getting faster. But for false statements, it's actually getting harder when the statement is longer. So this means that when we read like rumors, especially false information, when it's really long and it's really hard, it's getting hard for us to judge its veracity. Right. Okay. So the next example that I'm going to present is a language production study that we have been collecting in combination of using Gorilla and the Tencent meeting. So in this study, we're interested in the language production ability of 3 to 6 years old children. So we have 3 tasks there. So first one is a frog story, and then we also have RAN, like rapid automatic naming. The participants, they have to name the objects or animals from the left to right. And we actually also have a picture naming task that I'm not showing here. So in because the kids are quite kind of young, only 3 to 6 years old, it's really hard for them, or sometimes it's hard for the parents to complete the online experiments just at home. So we have our research assistant and student helpers to use a Tencent meeting to collect the data. together with the parents. Okay, so here's a page, a screenshot from our experimental data collection process. So during this experiment, so we introduced participants an alien dog called Bingo, and the alien dog really wants to learn human language, and we asked the children to teach the Bingo how to speak this language. For example, how to name those animals or to tell Bingo a story. And we have a warm-up part, so the research assistants would sing a bingo song together with the kids before they actually start the task. And they would facilitate the data collection process as well. So if the kids kind of get stuck, they may ask the kids a question, what is happening next, for example. So the parents don't really get involved in this. They only need to help us to set up the experiment. And it worked out quite well. So we're currently analyzing the data. Okay, so but there are some limitations of some limitations of gorilla. So I found one biggest limitation is that the maximum reaction time is only 2 minutes per page. So this can be an issue for kids who kind of I don't know, so who kind of shy and who may not be able to finish their speaking within 2 minutes. So I think there's another bonus of using Tencent meeting. We can still keep the whole recording for the participants. But another nice feature about Gorilla is just like Qualtrics, we could limit the device type. For example, for this kind of experiments, you do not really want participants to complete them using their phones or tablets, right? You would like them to do the task using computers. So you can specify here that only computers, desktop, and laptops are allowed. And it could also limit the device browser to make sure that the stimuli will present. And I think another nice feature is that sometimes you could limit the collection speed. So if the collection speed of participant is too slow, and even if you provide a preloading function, but sometimes it can be an issue as well. So you could limit the connection speed. So participants' internet speed has to reach a certain amount before they can actually load the experimental file. So to summarize, I mostly use Qualtrics, Gorilla, and Mechanic Turk and Tencent Meeting in my previous studies. I find them to be quite useful. I think the only issue is most of them are not free. So I'm planning to explore more like free tools, as I mentioned, the Jazz Psych. And I find the data quality for experimental tasks, such as picture verification, pronunciation ratings, semantic truthment checks, and language production tasks are all quite good. But there are certain things that you may consider before you collecting the data. For example, you may need to specify their internet connection speed. You may need to know that they may have their limitations. For example, Gorilla only allows to record 2 minutes speech. And also you may incorporate catch questions in your experimental trials. So for the semantic truth judgment test, we actually have some 10 catch trials. So these 10 catch trials were statements that are very easy to judge. So if the accuracy rate of those judgment tasks are really lousy, like very bad, like participants could not even reach like 50% of accuracy rate, we may exclude the data from the participants. For example, there are procedures like that can be quite useful. For language production tasks, we found it's really useful if we prepare a script in advance to make sure that everybody who's collecting the data actually following the script. It's a little bit like you are being an actor or actress, so you are speaking the same instructions to participants, so everybody can get the same information. So I think it's quite important to rehearse before you actually go out there and collect data. And also, there are other features that I haven't been used before, but I would like to use in future. So I think Gorilla has a very nice function of eye tracking. So it's a web-based eye tracker. So if you use Gorilla, you can collect eye tracking data using the webcam as well. I think this is quite nice. And there are a couple of papers out there that you may read. So if you like to read this, if you like to use this function, I think this is a pretty good to collect data from case and from participants that are difficult to access to. And also, if you are interested in this eye tracking thing, you may check out the webinars from Gorilla. And also, Gorilla will allow you to track, to do mouse tracking, so to track where the participants were clicking. So in these webinars, they'll have information there. I think it'd be good to check it out. Okay, I think that's almost the end of my talk. So I would like to say thank you to my collaborators and the supervisors and the students and RAs who helped me to conduct all those experiments. So yeah, and this is a WeChat official account of our lab groups. So if you are interested in our studies, please feel free to scan this QR code. And thank you very much for being here as well. I'm happy to take questions.